Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Parent Power webinar. I am so glad to see you guys tonight. And as our participants start to come in and we get settled, I'm going to give you some information, some rules about tonight, some administrivia, and of course, introduce our wonderful guest this evening. So let me begin by saying hello. And welcome to Parent Power. My name is Ruth Rumaks. I am the Director of Education at Ruth Rumaks Learning Space. And I am so pleased tonight to have Jen Makwana here with us. She is our Director of Educational Operations. She is a longtime teacher at RRLS. She has been my right-hand lady for, I want to say 14 years. Is that right, Jen?
That is correct, yes.
Oh my gosh. So it's crazy how long we have been working together and how many incredible things we have done together. Jen is also the author of our Alpha Mania series and our Yak Pack series. And on top of all of that, she is also a parent of two children who both have different exceptionalities. So she comes at it from both the parenting side and the educational side. And Jen, we're just so happy to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Fabulous. So let's get started. I'm going to tell you a little bit about us. For those of you who don't know who we are, Ruth Rumaks Learning Space is a direct instruction. We have a direct instruction pedagogy in terms of working explicitly and directly with our students. We have a one-on-one approach where we do a lot of hands-on, a lot of kinesthetic and multimodal learning. And we also work with small group classes. And of course, right now we are virtually everywhere. So we can be reached from all points of the globe, and we're working with our students one-on-one in this very engaging, very multimodal and multisensory way online. And we hope to be back in person, hopefully starting slowly but surely in the next couple of weeks again, and seeing our kids face to face again. So let's see what else we've got today. So before we jump into the meeting or to the ideas that we're going to discuss today, I want to first of all say that we've had lots of wonderful questions come ahead of time. We're very pleased about that. So we will be putting your questions that you sent in advance into our discussion. And we will be stopping at different times throughout the presentation in order to address your questions that come up throughout the presentation. So we'll be using the chat function. If you do have a question, put it in the chat function. And when we stop at that end of that unit, we will go and take a look at those. I would also say that there is a lot of information to cover this evening, and this is advertised as a 1 hour, 7 to 8 presentation, but I'm going to say that we may run over a little bit. I'm just giving you the heads up. If anybody has to leave, I understand, but we're going to try and keep it within the hour or maybe just a little bit over. I feel like this presentation is a little bit like drinking from a fire hose, in that there's going to be so much rushing out. You can get little bits of it, but of course, keep in mind that we do record our presentations and that they will be available to you afterwards. We're going to send those out with a link to our YouTube channel, as well as a handout that gives you more information or additional information. And also be on the lookout as we chat this evening for different links that we're going to put into the chat so that you can find more information about certain things that we're talking about. All right, so here we go. Parent power. Let's talk a little bit about the categories of special education and exceptionalities. That's what we want to talk about first. So we see in this lovely, I would call it a rainbow of needs, we have many different aspects of exceptionalities. And they range from the behavioral, the communication, which also includes the learning disabilities. That's the biggest category, as well as the intellectual, which runs from giftedness through to developmental disability, neuro and physical, as well as attention deficit hyperactivity or ADHD. One of the things that I want to say right off the bat is that ADHD is not considered a learning disability on its own by the Ministry of Education in Ontario. And that can be problematic or challenging to individuals who have children who have an ADHD diagnosis but do not have any other diagnosis. And since you can get an ADHD diagnosis, you don't have to go through a psychologist that does a full battery of tests to get the ADHD diagnosis. If you find that your child is having academic challenges, and they have only been diagnosed with ADHD, then it's something that you may want to pursue the psychoeducational evaluation, because that's going to give you more opportunities for accommodations or for modifications if necessary. But of course, you have to go through what is called the IPRC process. And we are going to talk all about that in a bit. And IPRC stands for Identification, Placement, and Review Committee. And this is a committee that must look at all the information gathered about that student in order to determine whether or not that school will allow them to access the different accommodations, modifications, or different resources that are available to students with exceptionalities. What else do we want to know? We do know that students with ADHD, 30 to 50% of those students also have a specific learning disability. So if you find that your child has only the ADHD diagnosis, but is still struggling, then it may be a good idea, as I said, to look into that further. Okay, let's move on. So let me talk a little bit about special education and the different systems and school boards that we have. So when we are at a private school, that's a very different situation than when we are at a public school, and whether that's a Catholic school or general public school. But private schools have their own system. So if your child is at a private school, or you're thinking of sending them to a private school, you really want to check out what resources that school has, what they can accommodate, how far they're willing to go. And because they are not bound by the same rules as a public school, you can only ask for a certain amount of things. And at a certain point, that school might turn around to you and say, you know what, we can't accommodate this any longer. Perhaps this isn't the best fit. So when you're choosing a private school, or your child is at a private school, you want to look at that best fit for your child. Is the curriculum something that they can handle with help, with support, with accommodation, or is the school just not able to give you what you need, in which case you need to look further. Keep in mind, though, that there are many private schools in and around Toronto and Ontario that cater specifically to students with learning challenges and other disabilities, diagnosed disabilities. And so those are things that you may want to seek out if you can't find the right support in the schools in your area. All right. Now, before I throw this over to Jen, who, as I said, is not only an incredible educator and has been with our RLS, Ruth Rumaks Learning Space, for 14 years now, but she is also the parent of 2 children with exceptionalities, very different exceptionalities. And she's going to share not only her insight from the educational perspective, but her insight as a parent. And we really value that, because, she walks the walk, she talks the talk, and she knows where she's coming from, and she's been there. Before I jump in and let you, or you jump in and get started, Jen, I do want to say to anybody out there, if you want to put in the chat what it is that you are looking for in terms of support. What are, one area that is really challenging for you? We can just put that in the chat now, and we can address that in a little while when we take a break. But it's really important for us to know, what are the ages of your children? What are the exceptionalities or the areas that you're finding most challenging? And then we'll get to know our audience a little bit better. And because we have some time, or may have some time, for some interaction, it's nice to know who we're talking to, and we can be more specific. So if you've got a moment, you can put that in the chat now. Jen, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. And I'm very happy to be here tonight. My main role tonight, as Ruth mentioned, is to take you through the different steps of the public school system. That's where my kids attend, and that's where I have my experiences, both as a parent and as a teacher. In my time at RLS, I've worked with many, many students with a wide array of special education needs. And I've learned a lot about how to support them both within and out of the classroom. So just a little note here, this model that we have on the screen here is from the TDSB. It comes from the TDSB Special Education Plan. And Joelle is going to put that in the link for you, or the link in the chat for you. It's from this giant document. It's over 200 pages, but it's a very comprehensive document all about special education in the TDSB. So it's a great thing to have. We are hopefully going to summarize it for you in the next hour. It does pertain to the TDSB. However, the Catholic Board in Toronto follows almost the same process, just there's some slightly different terminology at a couple of the different stages. So let me tell you a little bit about my background before I dive in here. As we've mentioned, I have 2 kids. They're both in the TDSB and they both have unique special education needs. My daughter's in grade 5. She was designated as gifted in grade 3. However, we decided to stop the process after the testing was complete. And instead of putting her into a gifted program, we elected to move her into the extended French stream. My takeaway from that is just because something is offered to your child doesn't mean it's the best fit for your child. And in my daughter's case, a gifted program probably wasn't a good fit for her. And she's loving the French program. So I think I made the right choice there. Then there's my son. He is in grade 2, and he's really where the bulk of my experiences in the system come from. With him, I have navigated through all of the stages on this flow chart. And I'm hoping to share my insights in each of them as we talk about each specific one. So I'll start with a little history on him. 3 weeks into his junior kindergarten year, we were called into the school for a meeting, and that would be this meeting right here, the school support team meeting. So he was having a lot of difficulty managing his emotions. There were a lot of outbursts, running out of the classroom, throwing things, hitting, all of that. We kind of knew that this was coming. In his preschool, we had identified already that he had some sensory issues. And so we knew that it was there. Any of you who have been in a kindergarten classroom lately will know, though, that it's a whole new ball game when you get to kindergarten, and the behaviors really started to ramp up as soon as he walked in those doors. But because I knew that, there was something going on, I was very proactive, and I booked a meeting with the school back in June before he ever set foot in the doors. This, looking back, was really the best thing that I ever did for his advocacy. And it's because right from the very beginning, they knew that we were trying. They knew that it wasn't just bad behavior, but they knew that, there was something going on for this child and he needed some support. And maybe some of you are in that same boat. Maybe your child struggles with self-regulation or impulse control. My advice is really to talk to the school, be open, be honest about your child's challenges. You really want them to see your child as a child who needs support. Truthfully, a good teacher will already see your child this way. A good teacher knows this and will see your child that way right from the very beginning. But I'm sure we've all come across the teachers out there who maybe aren't as good, who maybe are a little bit jaded, who are maybe very set in their ways. And it's whatever the case may be, we're all going to fight against those teachers at some point in our child's education. And so you want to be as prepared as possible to deal with those kinds of things. But even with all good teachers and all good principals, you're still going to encounter some obstacles. They seem, unfortunately, to be built into the system. And I certainly encountered them. And my best advice there is really just to keep looking, look for solutions, look for answers, keep asking questions, keep asking what more can be done. And if necessary, keep pushing. I really feel like because I was armed with the right knowledge and the right approach, it really helped to get me through there. So back to Zach, despite the many classroom interventions, these things right at the very beginning of the flow chart that we were trying, his behaviors continued. And in January of his JK year, he was diagnosed with autism. So I actually have the school to thank for getting that diagnosis, because I had already broached the subject with his pediatrician and was told no. And once the school got involved, I was able to go back to my pediatrician and say, the school would like me to investigate this further. And once they heard that, then I was able to get the referral necessary to proceed with getting the diagnosis of autism. So the next day, I requested an IPRC meeting. Did I get one? No, not right away. I was told we'd need to have more meetings. So we kind of slid back in the process a little bit, and we were back to more meetings, and I had to wait for those meetings because those were happening in March. And in the meantime, I, kept up persistent emails about all of the concerning incidents that were happening. I kept requesting more support. My son really needed more than just the teacher and the ECE in the kindergarten classroom. They were doing their best to manage the 29 other kids in the room, but that really wasn't enough for my son and his needs. At one point, the school suggested to me that he should maybe just come for 30 minutes a day. And I had to push back on that. It really felt like they were just pushing the problem back onto us. What's 30 minutes a day in class going to do for him? It wasn't really going to help him adapt to the school system. But I think the main reason that we eventually made some headway is that my son's behaviors were very visible. It's pretty hard to ignore a child pushing bookshelves over in the kindergarten classroom. So he got a lot of attention, but I do really empathize with those of you whose children maybe fly under the radar, because that is quite common in this system as well. And you need to push and persist even harder, I think, to get the supports that you need for your child. But really looking back, I think that it was my persistence. It was my understanding of the system, which hopefully you will have better understanding of after tonight, and just my helpful nature. I'll tell you more about my many, many suggestions that I had all through the process, but I always looked at it through a very I'm trying to be helpful kind of approach and kind approach. And that was really, I think, what pushed me along in the system. So we finally got an IPRC for him in June of that year. He was offered a placement in a kindergarten intervention program. And then from there, he was put into an intensive support program, or ISP program, specific for children with autism. And that's where he started in grade 1, and that's where he remains now that he's in grade 2. So back to our flow chart. We're going to talk about each of these things in detail, but I think it's just important to note that as a parent, you can initiate any of these processes, including asking for an IEP, requesting an IPRC meeting. You need the proper documentation in which to do so, but we'll talk about that. But it is a very slow process. There's a lot of wait time involved. You have to wait to get a psych ed done. You have to wait for the meetings to be happening. You have to wait for the strategies that they're implementing. You need to give them time to work. So it is a system that requires a lot of patience, a lot of waiting, and a lot of persistence. So let's get into it. Stage 1 is what's called the classroom interventions. So if you're here today, it's likely that you've already reached stage 1 at least. And this is where somebody's realized that something is going on for this student, and they've addressed it in some way. So if it's the teacher, they're doing some screening, they're doing some assessments, running records, whatever the case may be, but they're gathering information, and hopefully they're contacting you as the parent to let you know that something is happening, something's going on, and This is what I'm looking at. It may be academic, it may be social, and it may be behavioral. It could be any of those things. As a parent, your role here is to share any concerns that you may have. It may be you that brings the situation up to the teacher. Maybe your child is flying under the radar, and it's up to you to say, hey, my child is really struggling. Sometimes this becomes evident during homework, and that's the time to really talk to the teacher about what you're seeing, because they may not be seeing it. It's also the time to brainstorm your child's strengths and needs. You're going to need them as you move through the process. And if you have any suggestions for strategies that the teacher can try, speak up. For example, when my son was in kindergarten, I made a ton of visuals for him. He needed visuals to, help with his emotional regulation, to help, with his steps that he needed to do at his cubby. I brought in sensory toys for his calming corner. I brought in a digital clock to help with transitions. I had all kinds of ideas that I was just, constantly going to the teacher with and say, let's try this. Let's try this. How about this? Some of the things that worked the best were the things that were really focused on my son's interests. So he really was into numbers, which is why a digital clock was really effective at helping him with the transitions. He was really into the TTC and the subway map. So I based a lot of his visuals around the TTC map. And that really resonated for him and therefore was more effective for him. So if you can think of anything that's unique to your child's interests, trying things like that can sometimes be effective. This is also the time, if you have already sought out outside help, this is the time to get them involved as well. So if your child is working with an occupational therapist, for example, they have tons of ideas on things that can be implemented in a classroom to help your child. If your child comes to see us already, ask your child's learning specialist for ideas. We have all kinds of things that we work on with our students, things like graphic organizers, study chips, things like that, that can be transferred into a classroom setting. So ask us and we're happy to get involved and recommend some things for your student as well. But whoever is involved, whoever can offer suggestions, now's the time to get those in place. In stage 2, this is called this in-school support team, and in the Catholic board, it's called the school-based support team. So this is just what it sounds like. It's the people within the school who are meeting to discuss the child. So the classroom teacher may have tried some interventions and they may not have been successful. So now they're going to meet with other people in the school to develop some action plans for that child. They're also going to create an individual learning profile where they'll start to document some of the assessments and strategies that they've been trying. You're not yet invited to this meeting, but your role here is really just to maintain the communication that you've already started with the school so that you're kept informed on what's happening. Okay, and that moves us into stage number 3. Now, just going back to stage 2 for a second, for some students, the interventions that are put in place at that stage are enough, and it never moves any more than that, because the things that they tweak, sometimes it's something like moving them to a different spot in the classroom or chunking their work for them, allowing more frequent breaks for that student. Sometimes that's enough for that student to be successful, and the process stops right there. If you feel otherwise, it's okay to speak up and say, we'd like to continue moving forward. This isn't actually working, or we're not seeing these things at home. Then you want to move into the stage 3, where you get to come to the table and speak directly to the people that are involved. So the other people at that table are the same people as before: the teacher, the special education resource teacher from the school, the principal. But also, this is where they bring in some professional supports. So it may be psychologist, a social worker, a speech and language pathologist, a special needs consultant. All of those people are there, and their job is to evaluate the action plans that are currently in place and talk about further strategies that may be necessary. So this may lead to the development of an IEP, or it could lead to a referral for further support. So because those professionals are at the table, a psychologist might say, this looks like a student who's a good candidate for a psych ed, or a speech and language pathologist might say, this child could benefit from some speech and language support. They also may recommend moving to stage 4 at this time, which is the Identification, Placement, and Review Committee, or IPRC. I've heard from many parents that it can be difficult to move to this stage, that there's often a lot of pushback or kind of stalling from the school to move forward in this stage. So it is something that I've heard some people do need to persist with. I was lucky to get mine that same year, but I did, as I said, need to persist with, getting that meeting to happen. It took quite a few emails and follow-up calls to get that done.
Can I jump in for a second, Jen?
Yes, of course.
I think that this year this year, last year, the year before, right? We're really in a novel situation, in that because we've been in and out of school and in and out of in-person, I've heard from a lot of parents that it's very difficult to pin the school down in terms of getting these meetings. And I heard from one parent in particular who has been, that those meetings have been delayed and delayed and delayed. However, under the guise that they're not in person and therefore they can't do the meetings. But I would like to say, and we would like to say, that those meetings should be happening through Zoom. There's no reason why they cannot happen in this format. It doesn't have to be person to person and face to face. And that if you are finding that there's a lot of pushback to have those meetings because we're not in person, I think that there's cause to push forward with that, and not to wait until we're back in person, not to wait till the spring, and then it becomes the fall of the next year, and then etc. So my perspective is push a little further to make sure that we can get those meetings happening and on the schedule.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I've had an IPRC meeting over Zoom back in 2020. So they definitely are happening. All right, so as a parent, your role in the SST meeting is to attend, take notes, come prepared so that you can provide further input. And this is also the point where you can request an IEP. From my own experience, I've been to many, many SST meetings. I have a few tips. They're 20 minutes only, and that goes by so fast. And they're very strict about keeping them to 20 minutes. So they always feel rushed. There's a barrage of info. You really leave feeling kind of shell-shocked at the end of it. So here's how we can help with that. Go in knowing what to expect. The format is always the same. There's introductions. You get a copy of that individual learning plan. The teacher speaks to your child's strengths and challenges. You get a chance to talk. There's a quick discussion, and then they move on to the next steps. One thing that's really helped me in those meetings is having a binder. I made a binder for my son when he was diagnosed, and this has his diagnosis reports, any interventions that we've tried with occupational therapy, ABA, all of those kinds of reports are in here. All of the class, school related stuff like his IEPs and ILPs and all of those things are in here. And I have copies of everything. So in a meeting, if somebody refers to something, you've got it right there on your at your fingertips. And if they want a copy of that report, you can just hand it right over. You don't need to waste time with somebody going to photocopy it and stuff like that. So I highly recommend organizing all of your stuff in one place and having extra copies when you go into those meetings. Another thing I highly recommend is to ask for what you think should happen. So if you think there needs to be an IEP, ask for it. My son needed a safety plan. Nobody had mentioned a safety plan, and I knew that that was a thing that existed. And so I had to ask for one. And, he was exhibiting some violent behaviors in the school. And I wanted to make sure that every adult who came into contact with him was aware of his situation. And so that's what a safety plan is for. And I had to ask and persist until I got it. Also, this is on the next page here. I highly recommend going in with a notes template. And there's a copy of this in the handouts that we are providing for you tonight so that you have it. But this I made to really help me organize my thoughts as I went into these meetings and get down all of the information that I needed. So you can circle which type of meeting it is. You can write down who's present. You can have a pre-made list of your child's strengths and challenges because you may want to discuss some of those things. There's also space to write down your questions and space to make sure that you get the answers to those questions. Writing them down on just like a plain piece of paper, I often found that all my other notes that I was writing during the meeting, my questions would get lost and then I would forget to ask them. So it's good to have a spot directly to make sure that your questions are addressed. There's room for other notes. And then I think the most important part of this template is the next steps part. Because as I said, the meetings are very rushed. They're very strict on keeping to 20 minutes. And at the end, you really want to make sure that you leave that meeting knowing what the next steps are, and even more importantly, what the timelines are, because they're going to throw out a lot of information at you about, we're going to try this and we're going to try this and let's do this. But unless you leave knowing, okay, so we're going to try those things, but how long are we going to try them for? And how are we going to know whether they're working? What are we going to do to assess whether they're working? When are we going to assess whether they've worked or not? If you don't have those answers, you leave the meeting feeling like, okay, what just happened? And where do I go next? What do I do next? Where are we going now? So I highly recommend having that in the template or in your notes so that you can make sure those things are really solidified before you leave the room. Okay, and that brings us to stage 4, which is the IPRC meeting. This can be requested by either a principal after the SST meeting, or it can also be requested by you as the parent, as long as you have the proper documentation, that being a diagnosis. Your child does have to fall under one of those categories of exceptionalities in order to be eligible for the IPRC meeting. So leading up to the meeting, the principal's role is to review the student's assessments and evaluations and to provide you as the parent with a copy of the Guide to Special Education and an approximate date within 15 days of the request. Now, this, in my experience, and from what I've heard from many, many other parents, this doesn't typically happen. You may get the guide, but you don't often get the approximate date. You get a lot of, it's going to be sometime in the winter, or we do them in batches. It's going to be later in the year, something like that. So you may need to be a little bit more persistent in finding out, or just continue to follow up until you get that approximate date. But it doesn't always come within 15 days. As a parent, your role at this stage is to provide any pertinent documents. If you have any reports that you want them to consider about your child, provide them to the school before the IPRC meeting, because everything has to go in advance for the people in the IPRC meeting to have time to look over it. The IPRC meetings are also very quick, and you also feel very rushed in those. So you want to make sure that all the information has already been provided so that they have a chance to review it beforehand. Your role is also to attend the IPRC meeting, and you have the option to appeal the decision if you disagree with the placement. So during the IPRC meeting, it's not usually held at your child's school, and it's usually held somewhere else. And currently, as Ruth mentioned, they're being held over Zoom. It's made up of the principal from another school, a board official, or a psychologist, and then you attend along with your child's classroom teacher and the principal of the school. And during these meetings, they review all of the documentation that was submitted, and they use that to decide whether the student is exceptional and what the specific type of exceptionality is. This is kind of a formality because, in my case, for example, a developmental pediatrician diagnosed my child with autism. I didn't really need the school board to tell me that he was autistic, but I did have to go through that process. But after that, after they determine they do the identification part and determine which category of exceptionality it falls under, then they discuss the placement. So they hear from the classroom teacher and they talk about what would be the most appropriate placement for this student. And that decision is really the only guarantee that your child will receive the services required. Following the IPRC, an IEP or a new IEP must be developed within 30 days. And it will include information about the placement that was determined for your child. So about that placement, this is what special education can look like in the public school elementary system. So after the IPRC, you're given the option of either regular class support or special education class support. Now, you may notice this is the end of that flow chart from the beginning, that there is another way to access regular class support. You don't have to go here through the IPRC. There was a line coming from out here, which is when your child receives an IEP as a result of the SST meeting, they don't need to have an exceptionality or an identified exceptionality to get special education support. So for example, as Ruth mentioned at the beginning, if your child has ADHD alone as a diagnosis, you can still get an IEP developed and you can still access regular class support through this line right up here, but you cannot go through the IPRC and access it that way, or you cannot access it the other kind of support, which is in a special education class. So in the regular class support, it can take three forms. There's regular class indirect support, which means the classroom teacher is getting consultation from an outside support, either the special education teacher of the school or maybe an outside support. Like, for example, when my son was in JK, there was an autism team who came in and advised the classroom teacher on some different changes that she could make in her classroom to better support my son. There's also regular class resource, which means that the student or a small group of students receive support from the education or the resource teacher within the classroom. And this is the model that most classrooms in the TDSB use now. It's the inclusion model, where students aren't pulled out of their class, they stay in their class and the resource teacher comes to them. The third option is the regular class withdrawal, which means that they have specialized instruction. They're pulled out of the class, usually to go to the resource room, and they receive specific instruction, maybe on a reading program or on their writing or something like that from the resource teacher. All of these supports can only be up to 50% of the day. And some of you may be laughing right now because most often, there's nowhere near 50% of the day. Most of the time, what I hear from regular class support is my child gets 2 40-minute periods a week with the special education teacher, or the special education teacher comes into my child's classroom and circles the room, but she's got 10 kids to go to in the 40-minute period that she's there. So it certainly isn't anywhere close to 50%. The other option, and this option is only accessible through an IPRC meeting, is a placement in a special education class. And that can be a partial integration or placement in a fully self-contained program, otherwise known as an intensive support program or ISP. So this is where my son is. They have ISP programs for autism, for learning disabilities, for mild intellectual disability, for developmental delays, for giftedness, for behavior. They're typically mixed grade groupings. So in grade 1, my son was in a grade 1 to 3 class, and this year it's just a grade 1-2 class. But they're only available, as I said, through the IPRC. The partial integration model used to be the homeschool program, which was 50% of the day in the homeschool, which is kind of a strange name because it wasn't anything to do with your home. It was just the resource room at their home school where the kids would spend probably the morning doing language and math with the resource teacher, and then they would spend the afternoon in their regular class doing the rest of the subjects. The homeschool program, unfortunately, has been phased out of the TDSB. This is the last year that it's happening. And it's now really, partial integration is really just an informal part of an intensive support program. So for example, although my son is in a fully self-contained autism ISP, he is integrated into the mainstream grade 2-3 class for his math and his language instruction. For my son, that's what works best. He doesn't really have academic needs. So, and because he was with grade 1s this year, they felt it was best for him to do his math and literacy with the mainstream class. But he's still in the ISP class for the things that he really needs, which is the emotional regulation and the social skills and things like that. All right, Ruth is going to talk more now about the secondary support and what that looks like in the public school.
Jen, before I take over, we do have a question from Cameron. It says, are the attendees of the IPRC a TDSB rule or are they legislated? Our IPRC did not include anyone from outside the school.
Oh, it was only people within your child's school?
Sounds like that, yes.
That's unusual. That's the first I've heard of that. I've always heard it to be, and I mean, I've done 2 of my own for my son, and I've also attended one with one of my students. And I've always heard that it needs to be, you know, sort of more impartial people that are there. I would suspect if it changed that it's probably related to COVID in some way, although if it's Zoom, I don't understand why that couldn't happen.
Cameron is saying that it was from the French Public Board and that Liza said she had the same experience with the French Public Board. So that's news to us. I have not heard that it did not include somebody from outside the school because they usually bring in those experts to be impartial and to give, you know, not knowing the child, not knowing the family, to give the bigger picture view and their expertise too.
Yeah, that's what I would think. But it's possible that the French system maybe works a little bit differently. That's the first I've heard of it, but that's interesting.
And Liza also says, does it make a difference if we have a psycho ed assessment? Yes.
You can definitely bring your own. And in fact, that's what many parents do because it's a long wait to get one through the school. So you can definitely bring your own. You have to submit it in advance so that they have time to look through it, but they certainly take into account any privately done psych ed assessment too, as long as it's done by a qualified professional.
Yeah, I would say generally, if you are on the list for a psych ed, it could be through the TDSB board or through the board. It's generally anywhere from 1, sometimes to 2 years before you get that that documentation. And if you can do it privately and some health insurance covers the cost of the psycho ed, I would recommend that you have that. And then, you know, if the school is ready to move forward and you have the documentation, it helps the process move much faster. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about special education at the secondary level. And, oh, I'm just going to jump back. So Liza says, French school board does not offer psychoed assessment. We had to go externally. We provided that to the school and it certainly went very fast. Yes. So she's corroborating, validating what we're saying. Excellent. So let's talk a little bit about the secondary. And when I asked earlier for some input from you, our participants, is in terms of what your needs are right now, there are a few people, Michelle and Sheila and Liza, who have kids who are 12, 13 years old, who are going to be transitioning into high school soon. And these are questions that they have about transitioning and what the process is going from junior school to high school and how that works. So generally what will happen is when you have your IPRC meeting for, let's say, grade 8 moving into grade 9, any of the accommodations or the modifications that you have already put in place will be on that child's record and they will carry through with that child. So if there are things that you can be proactive about and think about, well, what will my child need for grade 9 or for high school that may be different from what they have now? And if you can get some of those things in place, even close to the end of the year, so that they're documented, it makes the transition a little easier for high school. So basically, your transcript, your file will be taken with your child and moved to the next level. Specifically, let's talk about what supports are available at the TDSB in the high school level. So we've got 4 areas really. We've got the resource program, which is in the regular classroom setting. Students can receive special education resource support from a special education teacher. And then we have that's something that happens, again, independently, that child may take their math credit or math course with special education support, or their literacy with special education support. We also have some special course options, and that's either the RSE, the Secondary Resource Program, which is a non-credit bearing assignment, something for students to receive support that has to be put into the IEP, and it's something that gives them skills, but doesn't necessarily give them a credit that would work towards their high school diploma. Then we have some optional credit courses, locally developed courses. Those are students who need to upgrade particular skills. They're not ready to dive into, let's say, the college or university level courses, or even the basic courses. But these are courses that are developed by the school to work on very specific skills for that particular child or group of children who would need the skills that are not offered in a regular classroom. Where most of the students that we see fall into is the GLE credit. And the GLE credit is a course, and it can be called a learning strategies course, or it can be called your, what are some other names for it, Jen? Generally, we use the learning strategies term. But it's basically a credit. It's a course that you sign up for. You will get you generally get 1 credit per year. So if you're in a semestered system, you may take it in the first semester, but not have it in the second, or vice versa. And you can get up to 4 credits. So grade 9, grade 10, 11, and 12, up to 4 credits of GLE throughout your high school diploma. Now, what this is that you are, it's basically a learning strategies course, but they're very different from school to school. And many of our students who have been in special education resource programs in the junior grades will, as they're choosing their courses for grade 9, their advisors at the grade 8 level will say, and you should be taking the GLE credit. This credit can teach you learning strategies like study skills, organizational skills. But the thing that it gives you the most is 1 contact person, that would be the special education teacher, that 1 person in the school who knows your child very well, who is with them for one course per semester or 1 course per year, and they are your contact person. So in a high school setting, when you are sort of throwing your kid into the regular system, and a few of you have mentioned that your children are transitioning from smaller classrooms or part-time special education support to a regular high school situation, you want that 1 person who will be able to answer your questions directly and to know your child well. So even if at the very least, this GLE course is a homework support room where your child goes in once a day, or however many times a week they get to see that teacher, but it's consistent and that teacher gets to know them, it's well worth it, because then you will have a point person to go back to when there are situations that arise. Also, the GLE teacher is there to answer questions for you and to make the liaison between you and the other teachers. Jen, you're going to jump in.
Yeah, Ruth, I just wanted to say Michelle had a question in the chat that she mentioned the GLE course to her son and he's reluctant to take it. So she was wondering if you have any advice.
So reluctance is really tricky, especially when you're working with these kids, these teenagers, early age teenagers who really want to assert their independence. They don't want to be labeled. They don't want to be put in a box, and they don't want to seem different than their peers. And I can fully understand where they're coming from on that. I think part of the way to get around it is to have conversations with your kids, and to do that starting now, right? We're in January. We've got a couple of months to get them to come around to this idea. And the idea, from my perspective as a parent and an educator, is more about normalizing the course. It's a regular credit like everybody else takes. But if we look at it from a strengths and challenges perspective, and we look at it from a growth mindset perspective, which is where I come from all the time, which is, high school has a new set of rules, has a new set of challenges, new set of skills, and we don't have all those skills yet. This course is going to give you those skills so that you can continue to become more independent. And if we plant the seed of independence with our kids, and we are encouraging them, pushing them, giving them the opportunities to be more independent. I also like to say we gradually release responsibility, but with the understanding that they may not have those skills yet. This course is going to help them get there, so that over their high school education, they can become more and more independent. You may also want to put it in terms of, this person is going to be your go-to person in the school. So it's good for one person in that school, one teacher, to know you very well. When you are at a big high school, if you're going to Northern Secondary, or you're going to Harvard Collegiate, and you are one kid in 1,500 or 2,000 students, that your grade 9 English teacher may have 7 different English classes, and they're not going to have the time to get to know you as well as your grade 8 English teacher, for example. So how do you get your kids buy-in? I think it's a series of conversations, asking them, what is it that they're concerned about? What is their vision for themselves in high school? That's a hard conversation to have with a 13-year-old boy, I know, or girl, but it's something that I think you need to kind of chip away at. So I'd love to give you more suggestions. If you want to stick around after the presentation, I will gladly have a continued conversation with you. But conversation is important, asking important questions without making a judgment at this point, but sort of planting the seed so that when it comes time to checking that box for choosing your courses, you've already sort of weighed the pros and cons and maybe gotten that child on your side. Okay, so.
Sorry,
Jen.
Ruth, I just wanted to jump in. I work with a student who is taking a GLE course, and she really likes it because they're learning a lot of different strategies in the course, but often they need actual work to, practice the strategies. And so she gets to do her actual work from her other courses to practice the strategies in GLE. So she kind of thinks of it as it's like a win-win, because I have less homework because I get to do my history homework in GLE for GLE. And so it's kind of like she's doubling up. And so that's what she really appreciates about it, is it doesn't feel like an extra course, even though she's getting an extra credit for it.
And she's got somebody to ask questions of, that she's not just doing the work blindly on her own. She's got again, that touch point person where she can come back and ask specific questions. And if that GLE teacher can't help with that work, then that GLE teacher is responsible for going back to the other classroom teacher to help support that student as well. The final aspect of support at the high school level would be an intensive support program, or an ISP, where there are a small number of ISPs at the different grade levels to support students with similar special needs. But of course, this is a very specialized program, and you'd have to be placed through the IPRC committee in order to be able to access that. All right, let's move on. Is this me too, Jen? I think it is. Yep, think so. All right, so let's look at what the IEP should include, because I mean, this is a big question that we get a lot, which is, well, what accommodations can I ask for? And what will it actually give me? So this is the first page of the IEP. Many of you have probably seen them before. You should be getting a copy of these on a regular basis, at least once a year, or if something changes mid-year, then you would receive an updated version. You want to make sure that it includes whether or not the student has been identified as an exceptional student by the IPRC committee and what that exceptionality actually is. Again, you can access support with an IEP, even if you don't have an IPRC or an official diagnosis, as long as the school is agreeable to it. That again is where, you're transitioning from grade 7 or 8 into grade 9. You want to make sure that anything that could possibly be helpful for your child is listed on the IEP in order to take it with you to the high school level. It shows the goals and the outcomes for the next school year, and it also gives a list of accommodations or modifications or alternative programming or the combination. It's also going to tell us where that programming will be provided, and we want to make sure that the terminology is clear. Not just for teachers, we don't want to just use teacher language or teacher speak, but that parents understand what the terminology is, and that students, as they get older, should have access to their IEP and have input in their IEP in order to make it specific for them and their needs. All right, so this is where we get into the how and the when and the where, or the altering of student programming. So we mentioned 3 things. We mentioned accommodations, modifications, and then other types, alternative programming. Most of the students that we see are going to be in the accommodations situation, although some are in a modification situation. And it's really important for parents to understand the difference between these 3 things because it helps in your conversation with the schools, but also in explaining to your kids what's happening for them and what's available to them. So an accommodation refers to the how or the when or the where of how that of that program delivery. And it includes things like equipment, not just teaching strategies or assessment strategies, the technology, the environment, all of these things. But the most important thing to remember is that with an accommodation, we are accommodating for that child, but we are not changing the curriculum expectations. That is key. So when we look at accommodations, we're looking at 3 types. Could be in the instruction, it could be in the environment, or it could be in the assessment. And when you look at instructional accommodations, these would be changing the way that the teacher approaches the student or the strategies that we use to meet the learning needs of that child. For example, we have some things like chunking information. So giving the student only a piece of information at a time to process and absorb and work with, and then giving them the next piece when they have mastered that. It could be scribing, so taking notes for a child or providing the child with notes. It could be using assistive technology, getting them a computer, allowing them to use voice to text or text to voice, yep. So a readback function. Those are all in the instructional category. Environmental changes or environmental accommodations could be where they're sitting, how close they are to the teacher, how free they are of distractions. It could be giving the student fidget toys or a wobble seat to keep them engaged. Noise blocking headphones are really important for a lot of students. And a lot of these environmental changes and even instructional changes can be universally good, which means that they can be part of the universal design for learning, which means that they're not just good for your child, but they could be good for the whole classroom. And sometimes having a conversation about making some tweaks to the way that a lesson is provided to the students by the classroom teacher may be good, not just for your kid, but for everybody. And it's always nice to sort of share that information. The other aspect is assessment. And this is an area that I think is really important, especially as you're transitioning into high school, is understanding assessment accommodations and what things work best for your child. So some of those, the most frequently used accommodations in assessment would be things like time and a half on tests, or providing a reader or a scribe, so that you have somebody read the questions to the child so that they hear them and then they write their answer, and maybe somebody reading back their answer to them so that they hear their answer and they know if they've missed something or not. Assistive technology is huge in the assessment aspect of things. And if your child isn't familiar with different types of assistive technology, then I would suggest giving us a call, because we are experts at assistive technology and we really set things up for our students. Maybe Joelle, if our audience members, our participants didn't get a chance to see our assistive technology webinar, Joelle, you can put in the chat the link to the replay, so that if you've got particular questions, you can watch the webinar first and then give us a chat. So that's accommodation, remembering that the curriculum expectations don't change. This visual, I always identify with the little one on the box in the first one, in that some of you don't know, you haven't seen me in person, but I'm only 5 feet tall. So, you know, seeing over that fence can be challenging. And we talk about equity versus equality, or equality versus equity. And when we look at providing accommodations or providing changes to the curriculum, those modifications, we have to look at what's going to actually allow students to be successful. So giving everybody the same size box doesn't actually help everybody be successful. But looking at the box size that's going to allow everybody to see over the fence, that's where the real success comes in. And so we want to make sure that whatever changes we make to the curriculum or the accommodations that we provide, that they're actually helpful and not just a blanket statement that we sort of hand out to everybody. Okay, let's look at the next one. So let's talk about the other side of things, which is a modification. This is changing the what, sort of the meat of the curriculum. And if we change the what, or the meat of the curriculum, then it is going to affect the credit outcome. So for example, a modification may mean that a student learns different material. So we have 2 books here. One is Hamlet, the full version. One is a Hamlet for Kids version, which is a modified or condensed version. It could also mean reading Hamlet in plain English and just understanding the story and the nuance of the story and the symbolism, versus really diving deep into the Old English. So the thing about the modification is that we have to really be clear of what the impact of that modification is going to do for credit attainment. And when we're in the, kindergarten through grade 8 range, it's not as important as when you're in the grade 9 through 12 range. And sometimes we can make modifications to, let's say, grade 4 math, in that the student is only going to learn, only do fractions up to a certain point, whereas their class is going to go forward. But what impact is that going to have for grade 5 and grade 6 and grade 7, etc.? I had one student many, many years ago who was on a modified program for math for grade 4 and 5. And we were working together privately, and through that private instruction, she was able to actually figure out all of the curriculum. We were able to complete all of the curriculum for grade 4 and 5 through the summer. And then for grade 6, she was able to go back into the grade 6 classroom with no modifications. She still had some accommodations for her test taking, but she was able to catch up at that point and then be ready for grade 7 and 8, and then into grade 9 to be able to take the the college university courses, which allowed her to get into university. And she's now a communications and marketing specialist. So, those stories where we had to put in a lot of work over a period of time, it was absolutely necessary for her at that time, but she figured it out, she got it together, she learned the skills she needed to, and then she was able to just really be successful with some minor accommodations as opposed to the modifications. Okay, I know I see a chat, let's see. Liza says she has to sign off, but that's okay, I get it. Let's see where we're at. Okay, so I'm gonna jump ahead a little bit, and this is a slide that's really important to me, because I think that sharing your students or your child's diagnosis is really important. And it's very important for that student, that individual, to understand what their strengths and their challenges are. We all know what our strengths and challenges are. Well, let's put it this way. Most of us can easily pick out our own challenges. We know what's hard for us. We know what's frustrating and what we are doing differently than other people. But for a child who has a diagnosed learning disability or ADHD or any type of exceptionality, it's sometimes very difficult for them to identify their own strengths. And that's the conversation that we want to have. That's what we want to lead with, which is, what are your strengths? What are you great at? What things are you really amazing at that you can share with your class? And then, as everybody has, what are some of the things that are more challenging? And how do we support you? How do you support yourself in building skills in order to take those challenges, take them from the challenging category and put them in the success or the strength category? And I think a lot of parents have some issues with sharing the diagnosis because they're afraid that their child is going to get into a learned helplessness situation where they're going to use it as a crutch, well, I have an LD, so I can't do that. But it really is how you broach the situation, how you talk about it with your students, and then, of course, how that child is involved in setting up their own learning path and figuring out what's going to be best for them going on. So overall, I recommend you have to share something. You have to let them know that the reason that they're having difficulty in a particular area is because perhaps their brain is just wired differently. Perhaps because they have a weak working memory, that it's hard to hold on to that information when they need it. Or if they have ADHD and organizational challenges, keeping track of their stuff is legitimately hard, but there are many strategies that they can implement to make it easier for them and to allow them to be successful. We don't want to keep it a secret. We want to use kid-friendly language. And we want to talk about that idea of growth mindset, which is, you may not have that skill right now. You may not have it yet, but you will have it if we keep working on it over time. All right, let's look at the next one. Just to sum up, definitely, if you're going to advocate, you need to keep organized notes. Jen is a master at that, and I'm so glad that she's included her note-taking form in our handout. Build relationships. As Jen was saying, you have to be kind but firm. You have to come at it with enthusiasm. And even when you're hitting that brick wall, it's important to take a deep breath, recalculate, recalibrate, and say, okay, well, how can I get this done in a way that is going to be friendly? And I always say you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. And follow the chain of command. It's important to look at, who do I talk to next, not just to sort of jump from teacher to vice principal to principal, or jump from teacher to your superintendent. You want to make sure that the right people are in place and that they understand the situation. Document all of your chats. Always keep a running, Excel spreadsheet or some document that says the date of your conversation, the date of your phone call, and what was said and the outcome of that, or what the next steps should be. And be realistic with what your child is able to do at this time, and making sure that you're supporting the things that need to be supported now in order to get to that next level later. Find a support network. So talk about it with your partner. Having a child with exceptionalities can be very difficult on relationships, and sometimes you're not on the same page. So if you need outside support, talking to somebody else is really important. There are lots of Facebook groups and meetup groups, and of course, educational consultants that can help with advocating. And we can be there for you too. So anytime you want to reach out and send us a chat, you can reach us. You've got all our information at the end, but ruthrumack.com. We are always available for a conversation, and we can often point you in the right direction as well. Just a little bit before we sum up about us. We do one-to-one support, both virtually and when we're allowed to in person. We do test preparation for those kids who are moving on to private schools or looking to do their SATs to gain entrance into the United States universities. And we have a ton of group classes that are really targeted, specific, skill-based, fun-based, lots of hands-on activities that range from everything from math, written expression. We have a very systematic approach to written expression for those of you who have kids with LDs in that area, that we can provide in a group class setting, which are small groups, as well as one-to-one. And what else? Let's see. What's our next slide? Running to the end. Oh, that's it. So I'm going to say we're going to stick around for some questions. I see that there are still a bunch of people left. So if there is anything specific that I can answer, I would love to get your questions. You can put them in the chat. And I would say, I wanted to answer one question that we did receive ahead of time, which is about ADHD and organizational, executive functions, and how to really work with that with your student who has ADHD, and how to get those accommodations in the classroom. So of course I put my notes down and now I can't find them, but let's see, give me half a second here. I'm waiting for, okay. So while I'm looking for that, I'm going to answer a different question, or actually, Jen, you can answer the question from Sheila.
Yes, sure. So Sheila asks, do you interact directly with teachers at my child's school? And yes, absolutely. That is part of our process. We have a very holistic approach to working with our students, in that we're not just there to, do instruction for 1 hour and then we're done. We have a built-in system where all of the communication that's necessary is part of your child's package. So we communicate directly with teachers, we'll communicate with a psychologist or an SLP or an OT, anybody that's a member of your child's education team. We want to be a part of that team and sort of form a circle of support for your child. So we have regular communication with any of those people in terms of what's happening for your child in the classroom. What are we noticing? How can we help with what's going on in the classroom? Or what can we do to, or what can we help, what can we share with the classroom teacher that we see to working one-to-one with your child that can maybe be transferred into a classroom setting?
That's perfect answer. I would say also that often, when a parent has kind of hit the wall with a teacher, it's nice to have another educator come in to pick up where that parent has left off. Not that the parent doesn't want to be part of that conversation, but sometimes, it's not working, it's not moving things forward. So we can come in and talk a little bit of teacher talk to say, these are the things that we're doing in our sessions, and we're finding them really helpful. And maybe these are some things, or here's an anchor chart that we can give you. Here is a technique that we've been using, and it's been really successful. So sometimes that helps to break the ice and allows the teacher maybe to try something new. And then we can get that conversation kickstarted again. So here's another question. How do I get my son to understand and accept these modifications and accommodations for extra help because of this idea of being different or having a stigma? And it kind of ties into what you're saying, Sheila, which is, if we want to be proactive as parents, sometimes we need some sentence starters, and to help that conversation go along, we can start with to the teacher things like, I just wanted to check in and see how John is doing, because I noticed that, homework is getting a little more difficult at home, and we're getting a little more frustrated at home. Is there anything that I can do at home that would help you out in the classroom? So you're kind of taking some responsibility for yourself, but also sharing that there are some challenges going on behind the scenes. Again, some sentence starters might be, I've noticed that my child learns better when this happens, when they have a break before they have to sit down to write, or when they get to walk around the classroom instead of staying at their seat all the time. Whatever it is that you find that's helpful. And some other kind of sneaky ways of getting in on the good side of the teacher might be, I know you have a lot of students, and I know you have a lot of children that you're supporting, but perhaps we could look at this. So sort of front ending it with a little bit of niceness. Back to the ADHD questions. Some of the things that will help, or accommodations that will help students with ADHD. ADHD is the attention and focus challenge, but we know that that is very, very linked to executive functions and organizational challenges. So things like extra time on tests to process the question and to be able to go back and check work. It sounds a little counterintuitive for some students, because some students with ADHD just want to zip through it, get it done as fast as they possibly can, and then move on. But we find that if they do have a little extra time on the test, the pressure has been relieved, and then it becomes part of their assessment strategy to finish the test, even if they want to zip through it. But then they are taught, we teach our students to go back to each question, and we teach a series of strategies and checklists on what to do for each type of question to figure out if you've answered it correctly. Often a student will read the question incorrectly because they want to move quickly, but having the opportunity without pressure to reread it to make sure that their answer matches the question can be a really helpful strategy and save a lot of marks. So I would say, we mentioned before, using technology, also using breaks and allowing the child to move around a little bit. Sometimes just changing the environment and limiting the distraction by noise canceling headphones, or by placing them closer to the front or closer to the teacher, or away from the door, or away from chatty children, other children, or children that they like to chat with, can be helpful. And some really key things are helping to stay organized. And again, I mentioned our executive functions webinar, which has lots of tips in there. But the idea of having a check-in with the teacher at the end of the day, and making sure that all of the homework has been written down properly. And then checking in with, if your child has a Google Classroom or some kind of platform where the homework is posted, it's important as a parent to be reviewing that on a regular basis as well. So those are some of our tricks and tips, I would say, for students with ADHD. And any other questions that we have? Any questions that we got that we didn't get to? Go ahead, put it in the chat if you wish, or if you have any other comments. I would love comments. I know we've still got some people sticking around. So if you could take one thing from today's presentation, what would that be? If you can give us a little bit of feedback and throw that in the chat, that's really helpful for us, because after each presentation, we do try and take comments from our audience and make the presentation stronger for next time. So if anybody has something that they really liked, something that was new to them, or something that was a reminder, love to hear about that in the chat. Heather says, thank you so much. Susa B says, what about gifted children that are coasters? Any idea? Oh, yeah. And let's think about that. Gifted students that are coasters. This is really tricky because they're very clever. They have figured out kind of at what level they have to put effort in to get results. And often I find that it's maturity that allows them to, either they've reached a plateau where they are in a situation where the work actually becomes challenging. And what happens is they'll kind of hit a ceiling because they're used to doing things a certain way. And then they realize, I actually need to put more work into it. Sometimes checklists are important. So if we have sort of expectations, a checklist of expectations for writing. So what are some things that I as a parent expect you to have in your writing, or the teacher has expectations for, and they actually have to go and go through the checklist to prove that they have accomplished those things, can be helpful to get them off that automatic pilot and make sure that they're checking in with what's actually expected of them. Jen, do you have any additional?
I would say with my gifted child, she's not exactly a coaster just yet, I would say, but I would definitely have a conversation around growth mindset and how your brain isn't necessarily going to grow and expand if you just continue to kind of coast through things. So if you want to talk about that idea of like, there's so much potential here, but it's not going to, it's not going to go anywhere unless you really challenge yourself. that might be something that.
Yeah, I like to put it also in terms of something that they have had to work hard at. Like, let's say maybe they're an athlete, they play hockey or gymnast, or they've learned the guitar, or something that actually took practice that was more challenging. I find this with my own daughter, that when she first started to learn guitar, it was something that she wanted to do. But it was like the first time that she'd really faced a challenge for something that she was interested in. And there were some points where she was like, I don't want to do this anymore. It's too hard. Don't want to do it. But she persevered. She worked through it. And now when we come up against issues in other subjects, like let's say math, I can use that as, well, remember when it was really hard to get bar chords and it was really hard to get your fingers in the places that they needed to be, but you practiced and you kept working at it. Well, we're now looking at the math, and we're going to put that same effort in, that consistent effort, because that's going to push you now to the next level. So maybe trying to relate it to something where they have had to struggle. In growth mindset, they talk a lot about productive struggle. And there is a point where, it feels really awful. You're just in the middle of it. You feel like you're never going to get to the end. It's never going to get better. But if you can push through that to the place where you start to see some results, that's where the true success and self-confidence comes from. For a coaster, they don't need to put in that much effort to do well. So we maybe have to talk about, as Jen said, the potential of where could they be with just even a little bit more effort, and what that would, what the benefits to them would be. All right, any other questions? No, maybe yes, no, maybe so. Well, I just want to say thank you, everybody, for being with us. And what's our next one? We have another one coming up soon, webinar. That would be, thank you, university readiness. So you may not be ready for that yet. Your students may be a little young, but if you've got friends or family who have got kids who are transitioning, it's next Tuesday at 7. You can get the link, register through our website, ruthrumak.com. And again, remember to reach out to us if you have questions, or you just want to say, hey, you're doing a great job. We'll always take validation and compliments. Thank you so much for being with us. And thank you, Jen. We really appreciate your expertise and your time, and look forward to doing it again with you soon.
My pleasure. Thanks, everybody.
All right, everyone. Have a good night.